being here today, and thank you for the Exmoor Society inviting me here to share a few reflections from the perspective of natural England. And I'm just so delighted to be back in this incredibly beautiful part of England. It really is an extremely special place, and having the opportunity yesterday afternoon to visit some of the places up on the tops, coming down into the Coombe, and to be travelling over this morning with Harry, just being struck again by the incredible time depth that exists in this landscape. It wasn't something that was created yesterday or even in the last century, and indeed, depending on how far you go back in terms of the forces that have shaped this place, of course you go back a very long way to the Devonian and to the Carboniferous, when some of the geology was formed that has created those hills that we see today, and the Jurassic and Triassic rocks that you can see on the cliff faces over there by the Bristol Channel. And then if you fast forward into the very recent past to about 14,000 years ago, when the ice began to retreat and people moved into this landscape, at least half the time since then it was hunter-gatherer communities that were shaping and using the land here. And then during the Neolithic Revolution, people began to farm. Social and technological change led to the Bronze Age and Iron Age revolutions, and then for a very brief period of 350 years the country was occupied by the Romans. Social collapse followed for the Dark Ages, and then a Norman invasion getting on for 1,000 years ago, followed by the medieval period and the Black Death. All of these things we've heard about already this morning, feeding into agricultural and industrial revolutions, fast forwarding into the post-war era, when we had massive changes brought into the landscape by government policy, including in farming, and including, of course, in terms of environmental measures that began to be put in place in that period, including in 1954, the declaration of Exmoor as a national park. And so you just think about that just for a moment, and you realise that there's nothing static about the landscapes right across these islands. They've been changed by people as a result of shifting social priorities, different economic needs, and that is a process that obviously continues into the future. And that point has been made a lot this morning, and for once I'm not really too bothered about repeating what others have said, because this is an incredibly important part of how we now need to look at the future, because that process of changing priorities and how that affects the land, it's something we need to embrace, as Harry said a moment ago. So what are the modern priorities that we now need to reflect in how we think about change into the future in terms of our national parks, including this one? So again, to repeat what others have said, of course, we're now all fully aware that we face a very serious climate change emergency. Rising concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have already led to a dramatic level of warming. We're already between 1.1 and 1.2 degrees of warming above the pre-industrial period, and we know that the danger level that's being set out by the scientific community is at 1.5 degrees. This means we need to be slashing emissions at least by 50% by 2030 and getting to net zero by 2050. An incredibly challenging trajectory, but one that has been reinforced endlessly now, not only in the science, but also in the global political debate, including at COP26 just a few months ago. In parallel with the climate change emergency, and fundamentally linked to it, is a nature emergency, different reflections of that, including a mass extinction of animals and plants. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the sister agency of the IPCC a couple of years ago, set out an estimate of 1 million species globally being in danger of extinction, 1 in 7 species in this country, as Harry said, in danger of disappearing from these islands. And on top of that, not only is there a loss of diversity at that macro level in terms of species numbers, but also a rapid decline in abundance that's taking place, with a report this week revealing a 50% reduction in insect populations across the globe in just a few decades, linked to things that we know about, including intensive agriculture and also climate change. On top of this, we have various priorities in terms of public health and well-being that we need to be reflecting in how we look at land in the future. We have an obesity epidemic across many Western countries, people more depressed, more anxious, living in urban settings where they don't have access to green space, and we know that improving some of those public health trends can be linked to greater ability of people to get outside and enjoy the natural world. Another priority that's been thrust centre stage during recent months in particular is food security, linked to what's going on in Eastern Europe, but also deeper trends there, which are not only about trade and conflict, but also about soil damage and the loss of biodiversity, given how so much of our food production does depend on healthy environments. And then on top of that, of course, economic questions, including in this country at the moment, a cost of living crisis. So all of these things need to be embraced together, and that is something that I think now needs to be reflected in how we think about the near-term future. Now, when it comes to the environmental pieces, we can see the trajectory of massive reductions in greenhouse gases being something we need to focus on, not only in terms of energy and transport and heating, but also in terms of how we use the land. And the nature recovery piece now being reflected increasingly, not only as something which is about protected areas, but also about how we so-called mainstream nature recovery into other sectors. And of course the one that's in this country, which is most prominent, and which indeed globally is most prominent, is agriculture, and how we find that common accommodation between farming on the one side and food security and nature recovery on the other. And actually, that phrase, nature recovery, I think invites us to think about these questions differently. Because when in 1954 this was declared as a national park, and many of those sites of special scientific interest that you've seen put on the maps this morning were conceived, we were having a different conversation. And this is a really important point, because 50 years ago, and indeed even 10 or even 5 years ago, it was conservation that we were talking about, whereas now we're talking about nature recovery. This is different. We've reached the point where we know we don't have enough nature anymore, and hanging on to the remnants that we had, a population of a rare species here, a rare habitat somewhere else, we now need to go beyond and get into a phase which is about rebuilding the state of nature to get it into a better place in the future. Now, at Natural England, a couple of years ago when I came in as chair, we started talking about nature recovery as being the priority, moving beyond conservation, and then we began to have that discussion with various colleagues and friends and partners and different groups that we work with, including the national parks. And it became evident that when we were talking about nature recovery, some of our friends were hearing something different. And this then led us to have a conversation in Natural England at board level to think about what actually we were talking about. And so we decided it's 4 things that we need to be pursuing at once in this process of nature recovery. And yes, one, of course, is biodiversity. The characteristic animals and plants that live in different geographies, we need to rebuild those populations, make them more resilient, bring back things that are now missing. And that biodiversity I sometimes refer to, which I think is a more user-friendly phrase, I talk about the web of life, because it's all interconnected. And indeed, we've heard that message this morning about how the bird and insect populations that are sitting above ground are fundamentally connected to the soil biota, and how all of these things need to be recovered together. So that biodiversity piece, seeing it as a web of life, perhaps helps us to understand some of the challenges that we need to be embracing. On top of the biodiversity, and indeed very prevalent in terms of the priorities of national parks and other protected landscapes, is the notion of beauty. We need to, at the same time as rebuilding the health of the web of life, to be preserving and enhancing the beauty of landscapes. And anyone who enjoys wildlife, of course, will know that seeing a rare bird in a place like Exmoor is much more rewarding than seeing that same rare bird in the Tesco's car park. And you will see on Twitter many people charging around the country with telescopes looking for rare birds in Tesco's car parks, and that's absolutely wonderful. But actually separating those two things, rarity and specialness from beauty, really doesn't help us. And what we need to be doing is blending the recovery of the web of life into the process of protecting and enhancing beauty for all the reasons that we know about. Feeding the human spirit, being able to increase people's sense of well-being, and being able to create those intangible impacts on people which are absolutely vital for how they are. And then a third piece which now needs to be blended in, which we know about, and which is linked to parallel crises that are going on. And we encapsulate this third value of nature recovery in the idea of ecosystem services. We know that we cannot solve the climate change challenge to get to net zero by 2050 without protecting and restoring ecosystems. There is so much carbon going into the atmosphere from deforestation and soil damage. If we don't fix that, we are not going to be able to stay below 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees of global warming. So we have to embrace this wider set of practical values alongside the protection of the web of life and its restoration and rebuilding and beauty. We need to be catching carbon in the landscape and also looking at other services, including those linked to the water environment and the purity of rivers and indeed the supply of water and the protection of communities from the impacts of climate change through reducing flood risk. All of these things need to be brought into the same programme of nature recovery. And then on top of that, of course, is the cultural and historic environment which has created some of these beautiful and diverse places that we value so much in the modern world. And again, that point has been made repeatedly this morning. And if you just go outside and walk in that landscape there, you can see how these things are layered on top of each other. And the challenge, as we see it at Natural England, is to do nature recovery in all four ways at once, and preferably in the same place. So is this possible to do? Well, the answer is yes, it is. And we already have some fantastic examples of where it's happening. Some of them you can see not very far from here, but one of my favourite examples is the Yorkshire Dales hay meadows, protected as a special area for conservation, globally significant biodiversity there in terms of plants and wading birds that breed in those landscapes, in the National Park in Yorkshire, which is protected for its scenic beauty, but which in those same fields that harbour that incredible biodiversity, you have ecosystem services, carbon being drawn from the atmosphere by the vegetation, accumulating in the soils, and that healthy soil and that healthy grassland holding water back in the environment, reducing flood risk downstream in towns like York. And of course, it's a cultural landscape. If you left it, it would turn into some kind of scrubby woodland, but it's been maintained over centuries because it was part of an agricultural economy, and that cultural landscape is still there with dry stone walls and the stone field barns, all contributing those different values in the same place all at once. And this, for me, I think, is the driver that we now need to be putting behind the idea of nature recovery. And of course, one of the best places to be able to pursue that multiple agenda delivery plan, to use that phrase, Robin, is right here in our national parks. Now, happily, we have a new set of tools coming into play that are going to help us to do this. We're moving from conservation to nature recovery, and in the policy sphere in particular, we have quite a lot of new stuff beginning to emerge. One, which many people in the room will be familiar with, is the so-called environmental land management policy. 3 new schemes coming forward, all of them at different stages of development, ambitious landscape recovery projects living alongside so-called local nature recovery schemes, and then the Sustainable Farming Initiative looking much more in the fields that are producing food to be able to create different, more sustainable outcomes there. Lots of detail still to work through, but the shift to be rewarding people in agricultural activities and other land managers to be delivering some of the public goods that we know we need to deliver from the land, a big shift that's taking place right now. And of course, it's not only policy that's driving this shift in perspective. Speaking to Robin this morning and speaking to many farmers around the country over recent years, you can begin to see this shift in philosophy that's beginning to catch hold. Real leadership being shown by different farmers in different kinds of landscapes where they're putting 2 and 2 together, building stronger farm businesses at the same time as rebuilding natural capital and bringing wildlife back to food-producing land. On top of that, we have a nature for climate policy, hundreds of millions of pounds now being spent by government investing in the recovery of carbon in the landscape. Trees and peatlands are the big priorities there, but also looking at agricultural grasslands is one of the ways in which we might do that. There's science going on that's helping us to understand some of the opportunities. And if we do this right, of course, being able to create opportunities for adaptation at the same time. Another tool that's coming through in parallel, being consulted on at the moment, is the notion of so-called biodiversity net gain, whereby if you're developing housing or infrastructure, you will be required to buy units of biodiversity recovery elsewhere in the landscape. Could this be a tool that the national parks could be using? Well, it could be. more work needs to be done to understand how we can bundle up credits that are coming into the market so that people building houses can be paying for the compensation for that, including in places like Exmoor. And then, of course, as part of the nature recovery mix, we have our incredibly important protected area network. Thousands of sites of special scientific interest, hundreds of national nature reserves, and we know from the work of Sir John Lawton over 12 years ago now that we need to be using these places to build more, bigger, better and connected habitats across the country. And so at Natural England we're looking very hard at the national nature reserves in particular at the moment, and have a very exciting pipeline of new ones coming forward which will be used to help build the kind of thing that Harry was talking about just a moment ago in terms of that nature recovery network, alongside these other tools that are there. And then of course we have the work of the non-governmental organisations, the fantastic work of the wildlife trusts, the RSPB and the National Trust, working at landscape scale to start piecing together some of the places that exist between some of these isolated patches of habitat to be able to create more from what's already there. Briefly mentioned this morning has been the prospect of private finance coming into the landscape for water and carbon in particular, rewarding landowners through the allocation of private investment. It's still embryonic, it's not really there yet, but we have a few glimpses of where this is beginning to happen, and Harry's mentioned water companies investing in the reduction of pesticides is one example of where that might go into the future. Another area of policy is the development of a so-called species recovery task force. We're just recruiting a chair for that at the moment, or DEFRA is, and of course much activity and interest across the country, including right here, in bringing back animals and plants that have disappeared. Right here, maybe in a few years we'll see the black grouse coming back. Maybe the curlew was a breeding bird. Ring-ouzel, perhaps that may be back here at some point in the not too distant future. Pine marten has been mentioned, and I understand plans are afoot for the recovery of that animal in this part of the world. The red squirrel, the beaver, getting a lot of attention and a policy being written on that at the moment. And of course the wildcat, an animal that I believe actually the last English wildcat was killed here in Exmoor back in the 19th century. Maybe this will be the first place for it to come back again. And then spectacular creatures like the white-tailed eagle, which I had a little glimpse of the future actually up on the top of the moor yesterday as we were driving along. We had to screech to a halt and leap out of the car as a white-tailed eagle flew across the road, pursued by a raven. I mean, I've been in conservation working in this field now for 36 years or so, and I have to say that at the beginning of my time working in this particular endeavour, I would have found it very hard to believe that we would see that kind of bird back again in southern Britain, but it is back, and these animals hopefully will be breeding once again quite soon. So all of this, that toolkit you could call it, the protected areas, the farm policy, the biodiversity net gain, the work of the NGOs, the species reintroductions, at Natural England we've set ourselves the task of using all of that to do what we know needs to be done through the creation of the Nature Recovery Network. And actually, I was president of the Wildlife Trust, wasn't I, Harry, when this idea was first being knocked around, and probably there's no accident that it now appears high on the agenda at Natural England. But that idea of the Nature Recovery Network, it's enshrined in the 25-year Environment Plan. There's some numbers that are put behind it, 500,000 hectares by whenever it is, 2042 or something. I think we can do that quicker, and I think we can do that bigger, given the energy and the momentum that's now emerging behind the nature recovery agenda. But that National Nature Recovery Network, as Harry's map described a moment ago, with the fine analysis revealing where the good habitats remain, and crucially where they can be created into the future, we're going to have a new spatial planning tool for that coming forward soon in the form of local nature recovery strategies, which will be developed at county level in partnership with the many actors involved, and critical to the success of all of that, of course, will be the national parks. So the National Nature Recovery Network will have momentum behind it coming from the bottom up through the kinds of conversations that are going on more locally across England. And all of these things together will have to ladder up to be able to have impact in synergy with one another to meet two very important targets that government has now set. One, to have 30% of the country reflecting the science that has been mentioned in conservation management by 2030, and also a very challenging target to halt and reverse the decline in the abundance of nature. So those numbers about insects and birds that we're reading, we're going to have to, by 2030, halt and reverse that. That is the policy goal that government has set out, and these targets are going to be enshrined in law as a result of the Environment Act of 2021, and that's being consulted on at the moment. And so if we are going to do all of this, we're going to need to take a different approach to pretty much everything that's been in the toolkit for the past 70 odd years. And actually a green paper is being consulted on right now, looking at the complex question of how we look to the future of the sites of special scientific interest, and indeed the delivery bodies. Do we need something like Natural England into the future? I think we probably do. Anybody in the audience who's got opinions on that, do go to the DEFRA website, look at the consultation and maybe put in some answers to some of the questions. And already in the discussion this morning informally over tea and coffee, various people have been bringing points to my attention, and happily at the moment we have a place where we can actually take some views into a government process. So I would encourage you to look at that if you are able to spare the time. So our ambition at Natural England on this question of nature recovery, changing gear from conservation into rebuilding the health of the natural environment in the context of going to zero carbon, is about bringing lots of different pieces together. And there's no better place, of course, to bring those pieces together, given the agenda of the national parks, than in the national parks and the areas of outstanding natural beauty, the protected landscapes, which of course is also now on the agenda through the government's follow through with the Glover review, and how we can build these synergies between beauty, the web of life being restored, the protection and enhancement of the cultural landscape, and how we can do all of this in the context of those ecosystem services. That is now the key question. And it is beginning to happen, and certainly when it comes to the protected landscapes, we're putting a lot of effort now in Natural England into rebuilding our capability in this area. When I came to the organisation just a few years ago, we had suffered from a very sustained and very serious period of reducing budgets, and one of the things that got squeezed really into the margins was the work that we were doing with the national parks and the AOMBs and the national trails. We're now trying to restore some of that, and we're putting in quite a lot of effort now, including through a tripartite agreement between Natural England, National Parks England and the National Association for Areas of Outstanding Natural Beauty, to try and find common cause across our statutory remits. Because individually we've got quite a lot of power and influence. If you put it together, it unleashes a completely different level of impact. And that is the key, I think, to how we're going to be able to go forward in creating the kinds of change that we need. And to guide that work, we've created a new Natural England Landscape Advisory Panel, populated with experts and practitioners, including Sarah from the National Park. We were very happy to have working as a group to advise the Natural England Board on how we create these synergies and really drive the impact to the next level needed. And we're also helping to fund nature recovery officers across the country to be working with the national parks, and we're feeding in to the Glover review and very much looking forward to being a member of a new national partnership between the AOMBs, the national parks and Natural England, to be really lifting up the integrated action that we need. So I just finish with one thought about all of this, because what I'm describing is really quite complicated. There's lots of moving parts, and some of the moving parts aren't even finished yet, especially the agricultural policy. But if we are going to put all this together, all of those different policies, it's only going to work if we can build partnerships to do the delivery. And this is why at Natural England a couple of years ago we reformulated our mission. We sat down, we looked at all these things about what do we mean by nature recovery, what do we think we're going to do with all these different tools that are coming through. And we said our mission today at Natural England, we're going to call it Building Partnerships for Nature's Recovery, and that's what we're now doing. And we're recruiting people to come into the organisation who not only are expert ecologists, but are also people who can go out into the landscape and start to build the relationships needed to shift into that new gear. And so it's all about partnership. it's all about people, and the other P that it's all about is about place. Because if you wanted to do nature recovery in Exmoor, it's going to be a very different process to doing nature recovery in Cambridgeshire, where I live. Very different landscape, different economic drivers, different social conditions, and therefore we have to be responsive in particular places. And one of the things we're trying to do at Natural England, having successfully made the case for a restoration of our budget, which is now getting back to where it was 10, 15 years ago, one of the things we have to do is to rebuild our front line. That's how I put it. The boots on the ground, the people who go out and speak to the farming communities, the people who can liaise with the local authorities, the people who can work in partnership with the National Trust and everybody else. Rebuilding that group of people to be active in forging those partnerships is one of the things that we are now doing. And so that, I think, Robin, is the bit where the policy meets delivery, is getting out into the landscape, being able to forge the partnerships, find the common cause, being able to use the science to drive us in this programme that we know we now need to embark upon. This is an incredibly exciting moment, actually, having been involved in different ways in the environmental scene for quite a few years. I've never seen this level of ambition or activity. And the fact that I'm repeating so much of what's already been said this morning, I find is an enormous source of encouragement. There's a high level of convergence going on, not just between Natural England and the national parks, but also between the many actors whose livelihoods and whose lives depend on the health of those landscapes. Thank you very much indeed.